Okay, so let's talk a bit more about some of these particular sources. And we've talked about Scripture as a source for Christian ethics. Of course, from your various Bible and other theology classes, I'm sure you've seen something like this before, but just to kind of go over it again, when we talk about the Christian Scriptures, what are we talking about? The Hebrew Scriptures are Old Testament and the New Testament. There will be some variations among traditions about some of the apocryphal books and the extent to which they're Scripture, but we have a fairly broad agreement on this. So the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, we can break into the law, the prophets, and the writings. The New Testament, we can break into the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, the other epistles, and the Apocalypse of John. Well, it's one thing to sort of talk about this and to lay out, here are some sources. And it's tempting to say, okay, this is fairly straightforward. I've got these sources. I can go to them. I can go to them sort of like a code book. But I think we know from some of our other studies that that's not really the case. And I just want to highlight here, with Scripture as a source of Christian ethics, there are things that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to wonder, how do we fit these into our ethical frame? And I'm going to show you a few examples of these. We'll talk about some of these examples in some detail when we meet together. But let's take the law, for example. So here's an example from the Levitical law in the book of Leviticus, and it is a law that authorizes and regulates slavery. What do we do with a biblical text that seems to authorize slavery? Here's an example from the prophets. This is from the book of Joshua, and of course it's part of the conquest narrative. God is telling, or seeming to be authorizing, his people to engage in genocide. What do we do with these kind of texts? What do they tell us about war and peace and about the character of God? Let's take an example from the writings. Now, I read Psalm 97, and it's a very exalted psalm, and of course the psalms are given to us for worship and edification. I love reading through the psalms and using them in prayer and worship, but what do we do with one like this? Would we read this one as part of our church lectionary or something like that? Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Well, maybe we'll have more luck if we say, yeah, okay, that's the Hebrew Scriptures, it's the Old Testament, there's, other stuff in the New Testament that moderates it. Well, what do we do with something like this? And this is a saying of Jesus himself. Jesus is telling us that we need to hate our father and mother, wife and children, brother and sister in our own life. What do we do with this as a source of ethics? How are we supposed to live in light of this? Here's an example from the epistles, the Pauline epistles. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak. Now, we can debate the role of women in ministry. Many of us probably in this class will affirm the role of women in all aspects of ministry. But even if you suggest that women shouldn't have certain roles in ministry, what do we say about they should remain silent? They are not allowed to speak. What does this mean for the relations between men and women? How do we interpret this? How do we deal with it ethically? How about some of the other epistles? Well, what about this one from 1 Peter? Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, the emperor as the supreme authority, or governors. Does this mean that we can never obey the law even if the law is unjust? What about the early Christians who were persecuted, who were ordered to worship the emperor And some of them refused to worship the emperor and were put to death. We call them martyrs today. Should we call them disobedient to Scripture? And finally, what about the apocalyptic literature? So here in the book of Revelation, in chapter 18, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself." What does this say about our relationship to civil society? Should we reject civil government and civil society? Should we withdraw completely from the world? Should we wish ill on the rulers of the world? Should we even engage in insurrection against the rulers of the world? How do we interpret this? These are difficult things. I think for each one of these things that I put up here, your instincts probably were, well, no, it doesn't mean that. No, this doesn't mean we should engage in armed insurrection or put ourselves in a walled fort in a camp like, some cult or something like that. And I think your instinct is right, of course. But why? How do we think it through? So these are problems, and we're going to work through them. And my purpose in doing this is to illustrate that when we're using Scripture, it can be difficult to use it responsibly when we're talking about ethical reasoning. All right, some other issues with using Scripture as a source. What is the relation? We've highlighted some of this in what we've gone through already, but what is the relationship of the Old and the New Testament? And really, maybe a little more specifically, what is the relationship between Israel and the church? Because what we call the Old Testament, of course, are the Hebrew Scriptures. They were Israel's Scriptures. They are Israel's Scriptures. And what do we say about Jesus himself, the person of Jesus, as a source of ethics? Well, relationship of the Old and the New Testament, what does God's relationship with Israel tell us about Christian ethics? And there are a few different ways we can think about this. And our textbook mentions some of these. And again, all of these things we're going to spend some time chewing over together when we meet in person. Well, is it separation and supersession? What does that mean? It means that the church takes over, Israel is no more. The church's ethic is a new ethic. The Old Testament ethic is an old ethic. There are Christian theologians who have said things like that and who think things like that. Is that the right way to think about it? Or is it seamless? Is it really that the ethics of the Old Testament, when properly understood, mesh seamlessly with the ethics of the New Testament when properly understood? There are also Christian theologians and ethicists who would say that. Or is it that we have to hold the two sources in a certain kind of creative tension? There are areas where they fit together, there are areas where they don't seem to fit together, and those tensions actually tell us something. That's another way to think about it. Or are there aspects of all three of these ways to think about it? So we'll talk about that. What about Jesus, the person of Jesus, as a source of ethics? A little more specifically, what do Jesus' death and resurrection tell us about Christian ethics? A couple of different ways that the textbook mentions that we can think about this as well. Is Jesus' life illustrative for us? Does it provide some examples that may be relevant to our lives, but maybe some other things that are really not attainable for us? In fact, might it even be that some of Jesus' teachings are given to us to show us that we can't attain righteousness on our own? So what is the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, for example? There is a strong stream in Christian theological thought, certainly running strongly through parts of the Reformation, that the Sermon on the Mount is really given to us to show us that we can't do it and we need to be justified by faith. Or, alternatively, is Jesus' life and Jesus' teaching really normative? Jesus is God's living command. His resurrection instantiates a new reality. The death and resurrection of Jesus actually do make it possible for us to actually keep the commandments of the Sermon on the Mount. There are Christian thinkers and ethicists who say and think things like this. Or do we think both of these things? Or do we try and sort of hold these things together in a certain degree of tension? What's the hermeneutical principle we might apply? So these are things we're going to have to think through and chew on this semester, and that we'll talk about in class.